Hello and welcome to the Wellness Plus podcast. I'm your host, Corrina Rachel, and I'm joined today by Jessica Manson. She's a holistic practitioner and licensed acupuncturist, and she's here today to share some health and wellness tips that come both from an Eastern medicine mentality and a Western medicine mentality, kind of the area where both East and West meet and agree. Interestingly enough, we learned in a previous podcast that both Western and Eastern medicine recommends that we eat animal products, contrary to what we've heard in a lot of other areas. So we will be learning about why the body needs animal products and some other health and wellness tips that you can start implementing right now. So Jessica, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Definitely. Can you talk a little bit about your background and why you have chosen to kind of bring the common ground between Eastern and Western medicine?
Okay, well, I'm a licensed acupuncturist. I went to AOMA Graduate School of Integrative Medicine and got my degree in acupuncture and Oriental medicine there. I graduated in 2015. Before that, I ended up having a bit of a scientific background. My family is mostly scientific. My father's a polymer scientist. And so originally when I thought I would study medicine, I thought I'd be doing something more Western. So I went through all of pre-medicine and did all of that at the University of Texas. I also did a bit of time in chiropractic college, although that wasn't really what I'd hope it would be, so I turned to acupuncture instead. All that experience kind of gave me a passion for Western medicine. There's a lot of it that's really fascinating and really wise and really true. However, once I came into the world of Eastern medicine, that entirely turned what I thought about the body and about therapies kind of on its head. And at first I was like, wow, this is just kind of weird. But really, once I kind of got through the weeds, it all made sense, even when I looked at it from a context of Western medicine too. So there's a whole lot of areas of common ground. I'm lucky I also work very closely with a physician who does a lot of traditional kind of Western medicine type procedures and things like that, but he's also very well versed in acupuncture, naturopathy, and things like Tai Chi and Qigong. So knowing him has also really advanced my practice and allowed me to have a very integrative perspective.
Mm-hmm. And then in the previous podcast, you had talked about how it was your own health struggles, so to speak, that kind of brought you into Eastern medicine, and you had actually approached it with a lot of skepticism.
Absolutely.
So you want to talk just a little bit about that, because I think it's so interesting, not only to have somebody who has now devoted themselves to these, more holistic and natural approaches to health, but that before you made that decision or made that transition, you were actually quite a skeptic.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yes, I was very skeptical of anything that wasn't double-blind, randomized, controlled trial proven. So I got a gift certificate to go to an acupuncturist for my birthday one year, and I had 1,000,001 problems. And I didn't think that acupuncture would really do anything for me, but I wanted to be nice to the person who gave me the gift certificate, and so I went anyway. And the acupuncturist told me that I should notice some significant changes within 24 hours of my treatment, and I didn't believe it at all and told myself, well, if anything happens, I know it's not placebo because I think that this is going to do absolutely nothing. And sure enough, I noticed some major changes within 6 hours, and I was really, really shocked. And the more I returned to see this acupuncturist, the better I got. And so that really got my attention, thinking that, I was so kind of rooted in this mechanistic view of the body and of the world that it was like, there might be something to this holistic stuff. There might be something to that. And so that really got me thinking. And after I really got my health back over the next few years, it made me even more passionate because I found that the changes that I was making in other areas of my life, like exercise or diet or whatever, tended to make me do better with my acupuncture treatments or do better with, across the board. And so I was like, wow, okay, I truly can't do something in isolation. And then as I went and I went through pre-medicine and learned about biology and learned about, happened to be in a molecular biology at the same time I was taking a psychology course. And so we were learning about sugar metabolism, and at the same time in psychology we were learning about addiction. And so I was looking at how sugar is metabolized molecularly in the body and what type of cellular response it makes. And then in psychology, I was looking at addictive behavior and like what certain types of biological responses can create addictive behavior. And I was like, wow, no wonder I feel so out of control with sugar. And so that really kind of got me thinking even more. I was like, wow, even these, these very, biomedical oriented type things kind of explain each other. And you wouldn't think that your sugar metabolism can explain how you think or why you do what you do. And yet, if we really delve into both, they're very interrelated. And interestingly, Chinese medicine and other integrative therapies have known this for a long time. Wow. And have preached this for a long time. So it was just kind of a logical step for me to go into an approach that's more holistic.
So to kind of dive into these health and wellness recommendations, one of the topics that came up in the previous podcast, you were talking about animal products and the body's need for them, and how interestingly, this is one of those recommendations that is in agreement from both the Eastern and Western modalities.
Yes.
So let's go ahead and I guess take that piece. Can you talk about animal products for our health?
Well, I think I'll start with kind of the basic health and dietary recommendations that you should have for a good long life. Eat real food, don't eat too much, and eat mostly plants. So I think that really covers it. I mean, when we say real food, that means something that if you had the best garden in the world that had every plant and every food animal you could imagine in your backyard, and you had the kitchen at home that you have now, if you could walk in your backyard, go and pick your dinner or kill and cook your dinner and do that within 2 hours, that's real food. So if I needed to if I wanted to make myself broccoli, I can go pick some broccoli, and if I want a steak, I could go and butcher myself a steak and cook that in the kitchen that I have now in about 2 hours. That's real food.
Right.
Granted, I don't think that I could end up making a Cheeto.
Although there are some fun shows where they actually do challenge chefs to try and make those processed foods.
That's right. But even if I really wanted to make a Cheeto, I'd be having to go like pick the corn, dry the corn, grind the corn up into a paste, and then mix it with a bunch of stuff, and then to make the cheese powder. I don't even know how I do that. I'd have to go and milk the cow.
I bet it doesn't have cheese in it.
I don't think it has cheese in it, and but even then I'd have to like go make cheese, which would take me several months to do, and then dry it out and make the cheese powder and call that a Cheeto maybe. So that's kind of how you can define real food. Don't eat too much. That's kind of self-explanatory. And then mostly plants. So if we look at how our bodies are evolved, we're meant to be omnivores. So if we look at the human mouth, we have a mix of molars that are grinders for fibrous plant matter, and we also have some in the front of our teeth that are more for ripping and tearing meat, our canine teeth specifically. So if we look at mouths of other animals, like say horses or cows, their entire mouth, their entire dental structure, is all full of flat grinding teeth because they eat plant matter exclusively. They don't ever eat animal matter. Similarly, if we look at an obligate carnivore like a cat or a lion, they have no grinding molars because all they eat is meat. For humans, we have a mixture of both because we're designed to eat both. If we go and look at human evolution and kind of bring ourselves back to caveman days, we can imagine that it's a whole lot easier to go and pick some plant matter and kind of snack on that most of the time, because it's a whole lot easier than going and finding an animal and hunting it down and killing it, butchering it, and cooking it. So we're going to be eating, by far, mostly plants. However, if we, encounter a rough season, if it's too hot or too cold or too dry, or plants become scarce for whatever reason, then that's when we will be turning to animal protein. And so that's where it becomes worth the effort to go on a hunt. Similarly, if we look at the human body structure, we are meant to be persistence hunters, which is why we're quite good at long-distance running, actually better than any other animal. So we're able to run longer distances without fatigue, more so than any other animal, so that would allow us to continue to track animals until they became exhausted and we could end up having our dinner. Wow. So for this reason, we're really meant to have, I'd say, about 80% plant matter in our diet. Plants do have a lot of really essential nutrients, and a lot of fiber that we can't get from animal sources. And we need a lot of fiber to keep things moving through our gut and keep our gut healthy. We also get higher concentrations of things like vitamin C from plant matter rather than animal matter. However, there's some essential nutrients in animal tissues that we cannot get from plants. So, for instance, long-chain fatty acids we cannot get from a plant source. So we'll take fish oil, for example. Those are all long-chain fatty acids, the DHA and EPA, that are in fish oil that help with brain health and nerve conduction health. They are called essential fatty acids because they are absolutely essential for life. Many people who are anti-animal protein will say, oh, well, we can combine medium-chain or short-chain fatty acids to make long-chain fatty acids, and so therefore flax oil can substitute for fish oil because we'll just combine it and make more. My response to that is that's all lovely. However, that's a huge metabolic debt on your body. So your body has to work very hard to create a nutrient rather than you giving it to it. Right. That therefore stresses the system heavily. And even though you will end up getting your fat, it's at a high price. And that ends up taking away energy that could be used to heal other things or to power other metabolic processes. So it's sort of like, if I were to use my emergency brake every time I decided to stop my car, I can stop my car that way, but it's going to have a whole lot of mechanical wear on the car. And so that is true, especially things, like branched-chain amino acids, long-chain fatty acids that we can synthesize in our bodies, but it's at a high metabolic price. So that and, I find that supplementing animal tissues, especially, this kind of goes back to Chinese medicine, although in a kind of ancient Western herbalism, this is also true. There's a big movement of eating the tissue to treat the tissue. And so say, like, if I have a muscle pain, I can treat that by eating muscle of another animal. If I have a bone-level pain, I can treat that by eating bone, or a heart problem by eating heart. And we look at this and, I'd say the ancient wisdom kind of just took it for granted. It's like, well, your heart doesn't work, so just eat some heart. Duh. But if we look at this kind of, why does this work? Say if I have a heart problem, I can make new heart cells. That's something that my body can do and replace the damaged ones. However, for me to do that, I need certain building blocks in order to create a heart cell. So say I need building blocks A, B, and C in order to create a heart cell. I could feasibly get, we'll say, 3 units of A from spinach and 5 units of B from beef and 10 units of C from eggs, let's say. But even though I've got 10 units of C, I've only got 3 units of heart tissue that I can make because A is my limiting factor. I've only got 3 units of A, so I end up kind of wasting all the rest of that C that I've accumulated, and I'm inefficient at creating new heart tissue. Conversely, if I eat heart tissue from another animal, what that allows me to do is I get all of the building blocks, all the enzymes, all the proteins, all the minerals, all the cofactors, all the essential fats that a heart needs are all in that heart tissue. And so I've got A, B, and C all in the exact perfect ratio, so I can take 100% of the nutrient that I get from heart source from another animal and convert that with a near 100% efficiency into new heart tissue for myself.
Wow.
This is why I used a lot of desiccated organ meats in my practice in order to help heal tissues that have been damaged. And I find that while we can support the healing process with purely vegetarian sources, it's just much less efficient. So, for instance, I had a gentleman who came in to see me who had a certain back pain due to a slip disc injury. And he was a vegan gentleman. And I've seen slip disc before. I've treated a lot of them. And typically, I'd say people respond within a couple of weeks for most of my patients. This gentleman, despite his best efforts, took about 18 months to have a response.
Oh, my.
And that's mostly because he was very adamant about not including any kind of animal products in his diet. And while I respect his decision, I think that is really why he had a much slower healing response than some of his peers. He just didn't have the nutritional building block to create new tissue or to maintain any type of structural change that we induced with acupuncture or laser therapy or anything else. And so it's very hard, like if someone comes and says, well, I need you to build a brick house, but no bricks. I feel like veganism very much kind of gives that same proposition. It's building a brick house with no bricks.
Interesting.
And while you can build a house, and maybe it will sort of look like it's got bricks, it's not going to be exactly the same as a brick house.
Interesting. So then you recommend organ meats.
I do.
What about things like bone broth is becoming really popular right now?
I think that's like the best trend that has hit the world in a really long time. I'm so happy to see everybody getting on the bone broth train. When I was beginning acupuncture school, on the first day of my first class, my professor told me, for a long life, you need to eat bone broth every day, 1 cup of bone broth at least. And I kind of sat there and I thought to myself, well, what does that mean and why? And he tells me, well, it increases your Jing, which Jing, according to the Chinese, is your kind of vital substance or your life force. And, and kind of coming from the scientific background I kind of thought to myself, well, surely there has to be like a biological reason for this. And it took me until I really graduated and got out into practice that I realized, well, bone broth is absolutely essential for your health. And the reason why is that whenever you go and you stew the bone, you're getting collagen, which is a protein source that's absolutely essential for creation of connective tissue. If we look at the functions of connective tissue, it goes and it's sort of like the glue that holds you together. So it comprises your skin, hair, nails, the lining of your GI tract, a lot of your nervous tissue, brain tissue, your blood vessels. It's absolutely essential for keeping things moving well, especially with joint health, too. So not only are you getting a good connective tissue support from the periosteum, which is the tissue that surrounds the bone, you're also getting a tremendous amount of minerals, which if we look at what's vital for life, calcium, sodium, magnesium, potassium are all present in bone. You also get a good source of iron if you do bone marrow as well, which can easily be depleted, especially in menstruating women. So we get a really good mineral profile from bone. We also get a lot of good essential fats from bone. So again, our fats allow us to have a slow burn of calories, allow us to be very efficient in how we're metabolizing our food, and are very utilizable. So people are often surprised. I tell them, eat fat in order to lose fat, but that's totally true. It helps balance out your blood sugar, and it gives you essential building blocks, especially for nervous tissue like your brain. So yeah, bone broth is one of the very best things that we can do, and it also is in a super digestible format. So whenever you boil a bone, you're basically taking all the nutrients out of it and making it into a super easily absorbable format. So many people who have digestive problems or have problems absorbing nutrients due to drugs or whatever tend to get a lot of nutrition out of bone broth. And it also tastes great, too. So I tell people, if you're going to do one thing for your entire life, make it be a cup of bone broth a day. Or if you're too lazy to make your own bone broth like me, you can do the powdered collagen. Collagen hydrolysate tends to give you pretty much the same benefit as a bone broth does. It's not quite as much on the mineral side as a real bone broth would be, but it's pretty close. So that's something that a lot of my patients like because they can mix it in their coffee or tea or a smoothie, and it doesn't taste like much, and it's just an easy way to get that protein in, get a good connective tissue support in, and also support all 22 amino acids, which are essential for protein synthesis in the body.
Wow. And then is bone broth also good for your bones?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'd say that, again, we eat the tissue to treat the tissue. So if you're having bony outgrowth like arthritis, I tell my arthritis patients, this is absolutely the number one thing that you need. If you do nothing else, have bone broth, because what that's going to do is give you correct amount of nutrient via enzymes, via minerals, via cofactors, proteins, fats, to create healthy bone and assimilate it well.
Interesting. And then what about people who maybe are not interested in actually eating the organ meats?
So for those types of people, I recommend a product line that I use heavily in my office. It's called Standard Process. Basically what they do is they create desiccated foods. Most of them are a combination of foods, which include plant nutrient as well as desiccated organ meats in many of their products. And they're put into tablets or capsules. And so that way you can get the benefit of having organ meat in your diet without having to go and make yourself a spleen burger for lunch. I know, I would not want to have a spleen burger, although I've seen a picture of one and I still don't want to have a spleen burger.
Wow,
so.
I didn't even know that existed.
Well, now you know. For those people who do want to do organ meats, there's a great place to get them. If you are interested in eating them, it's called uswellnessmeats.com, and you can order pretty much any organ meat you want that's mostly organic from them, and they'll ship it to your house. So for those people who kind of want to have a culinary adventure, there's uswellnessmeats.com.
Interesting. I feel like there should be a new foodie TV show just centering around organ meats.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's actually here in Austin, there's a restaurant called Pache that's downtown, and they serve a lot of organ meats, and they serve a lot of even cooked bone and things like that. So I think it's coming back in popularity. It seems to be a pretty trendy place. So I sometimes refer my patients there too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, getting back to that recommendation of 80% of the diet is plants.
Yes.
Do you have maybe a specific meal recommendation or how much per day?
How much per day?
Kind of turn that into something realistic for people, like how much meat they're eating and how many vegetables.
I think basically one serving of vegetables is about the size of a tennis ball.
Okay.
So I tell people aim for about 6 servings of vegetable if you can, and maybe 1 to 2 servings of meat, which would be about the size of a deck of cards.
Okay.
So yeah, you're by far outweighing your meat intake with vegetable intake. That being said, I do have some people who need a bit higher meat intake just because they have absorption problems. And so some people do better with protein every meal just because they're not absorbing a lot of the protein. Many people who tend to be more vegetarian end up becoming vegetarian largely because of their problems absorbing and metabolizing protein. I would argue those people need protein even more so than the general population, especially animal protein. They just also need an enzymatic helper along with it. So some people need a little bit more, and they just find they don't feel quite as well having less. But I think a good rule of thumb is you want to do about 6 servings of vegetable, maybe about 2 servings of animal protein, be that meat or eggs or fish. So yeah, that's kind of what I'd recommend there.
Right. And then in terms of the different protein sources, chicken, beef, eggs, things like this, is there something that you recommend, or you recommend people vary the types of animal products they're eating?
You know, I say do what you like.
Okay.
If you like chicken, eat chicken. If you don't, don't. Yeah, I think that the one thing that I do encourage people to do, which I kind of hinted at a little bit earlier, is to eat fats. There was a big trend in the 80s talking about a low-fat diet being more heart healthy. New evidence has shown that that's largely untrue, and by depriving our bodies of fat, we're actually encouraging more blood sugar problems, and it's the blood sugar problems that are causing a rise in cholesterol and a rise in systemic inflammation that is more heavily correlated to cardiovascular events rather than low fat. And we've been seeing a whole lot of evidence coming now that is really debunking the low fat myth, if you will. So I tell people, if you like bacon, eat it. You know, if you want that fatty brisket and you do well digesting it, go for it. Fats are absolutely essential. You know, eat the fatty salmon. Eat fat. It's very slow to metabolize and lowers inflammation. Even if we look at in terms of cholesterol from foods, I have a lot of people who are concerned about cholesterol and eating fats. What I have to tell them is this, is that cholesterol is used primarily in your body, 1, to make hormones, and 2, to provide a Band-Aid for areas that have been damaged, particularly in blood vessels. So say if your blood vessel gets damaged, what happens is your liver, which creates cholesterol, sends out a low-density cholesterol, which is formerly known as bad cholesterol. That's not really true, but that's what some people will call it. It sends out low-density cholesterol to go and patch the wound. It acts like a Band-Aid. And then once that damage is healed, that cholesterol reforms into a high-density cholesterol and comes back to the liver for recycling. So if we go and we look at people who have higher or lower levels of cholesterol, that is largely due to the amount of inflammation and the amount of damage that they're creating in their body, which I see more often. Sugars cause most damage in the body. So if we have a lot of sugar in our bloodstream, for example, and if that sugar is not well controlled, then that will create damage in our small blood vessels, which will then increase cholesterol levels. And we'll end up having a higher low-density cholesterol because we're having to send more out to create repair, and a lower high-density cholesterol because we're not sending as much back to the liver for recycling. We're having to send stuff out faster than it's coming back. Similarly, we'll see people who are in stages of healing have a higher high-density cholesterol because they're sending all of the cholesterol back at a higher rate than it's going out. So while foods are an important source of cholesterol, just getting cholesterol from your food doesn't mean that your blood level of cholesterol is going to go higher. It does not mean that you're increasing your cardiovascular risk in so much that you're lowering your sugar intake. And many cardiologists would disagree with this, but I've seen a lot of good studies, even in reputable journals, that do support it. So I do encourage most of my patients, when you do eat animal proteins, eat fat. If you like full cream in your coffee, go for it. It's better than the skim milk.
Right. Interestingly, I believe it's the advanced glycation end products. As your body's breaking down starch, breaking down sugar, that they actually kind of act like sandpaper inside of your blood vessels.
Yes, that's exactly it.
So interestingly, the recommendations to reduce fat to lower your cholesterol that usually tend to make people be eating more starches, more sugars, more grains.
That's right.
They're actually going to be increasing their cholesterol because those increased starches in the diet are causing so much damage to the blood vessels that now your liver is going to be creating more cholesterol than you were probably eating before.
That's absolutely true. Absolutely true.
Wow. Can you speak to, for those of our listeners who might be listening, and they are very pro-vegan, against the animal products. One of the most common things that's often cited is the China study. So I think it's interesting because now we're hearing that traditional Chinese medicine actually recommends you to eat animal products. Can you talk a little bit about the China study?
Yeah, a little bit. I do know that the China study came out, and it basically made most of its data by pitting a population of rats that was given a plant-based diet against a population of rats that was given an animal protein and plant-based diet. And they showed that cancer levels in the mixed source diet were much higher than the cancer levels in the plant-based diet. However, the Weston Price Foundation, which is a really great resource and food watchdog group, came out and found that the food that was given in the mixed diet group was actually contaminated with a mold called aflatoxin. And that the results of that study have not been able to be duplicated outside of an aflatoxin-contaminated food. Wow. And so yeah, many people who come to my office and tell me, oh, well, the China study means that I'll have less incidence of cancer if I, only do plant proteins. That data was entirely falsified due to poor methods. And unfortunately, it kind of got entrenched in our culture before it was exposed to be the errant methods that it had.
I think there's also this strong presence of these different industries. Obviously, beef, dairy, these are huge industries. Sugar industry.
Oh, yeah.
Really big industry. And a lot of those studies that were done that ended up being used to convince people to stop eating animal meats and to stop eating fats. A lot of those studies were actually funded by the sugar industry.
That's absolutely true,
So it's kind of interesting how we as the consumers are maybe the just kind of the monkey in the middle between all these big industry giants. And, when we look at the different dietary recommendations, and there's a vast, there are very many approaches to diet that often conflict with one another. I see a lot of people saying, oh, it's just overwhelming. One person will tell you to eat this, another person will tell you to eat that. And clearly, I think, it's important to point out that every person is different.
Of course.
And we're going to have unique dietary needs and things like this. But also, when it comes to the big diets that get a lot of attention in the media, or especially when you learn things from TV commercials, that a lot of times that's just the marketing from these different big industries coming in, rather than actually coming from people who are genuinely just trying to help support your health.
Of course.
And that kind of explains why there's a lot of this kind of conflicting information that you get when it comes to things like whether or not to eat meat, et cetera.
Yeah, I think the best way to kind of figure out what's true in that instance is think about if you're a caveman and you've got a knife and a bow and arrow and that's all you've got, what are you going to be eating? Are you going to be going and picking a bunch of rice and hulling the rice and, grinding it up and, processing it? To me, that sounds like a lot of work if I'm a caveman and all I've got is a knife. Or am I going to go and cut myself like a piece of fruit or a vegetable like a zucchini that I can just pop in my mouth and eat? Or, am I going to either face starvation and die myself, or am I going to decide to go and hunt an animal? So I think, it was a big struggle for me to kind of wade through all these conflicting opinions about diet. But really, I think that if we look back to our caveman nature, the question kind of answers itself. If it's something that would be very difficult for us to create or obtain with minimal tools, we're probably not going to be eating it because that's just too much work. So I think that, when it comes to knowing what to eat, it's more, if you think about it just from how much work does it take to create this? If the answer is a lot, then probably shouldn't be eating it. Which is why I also do advocate people keeping grains to a minimum or even taking grains out of their diet. If you look at the work that it takes to make a slice of bread, for instance, go and picking each little grain off the wheat stem and then hulling it and then grinding it into flour and then getting eggs and combining it into that and then, cooking it. I mean, this is a days-long process. And I have a lot of people tell me, oh, well, we've had bread for thousands of years. That's true. However, that's in terms of evolutionary time, just a flash in the pan.
Right.
And so, I can see, if you're starving, if it's a famine, will you go through all that work? Absolutely. But if you're in if you're in the Garden of Eden and you've got everything you could ever want around you, very unlikely. So I think that's how people can kind of wade through that advice is, imagine yourself primitive camping. You've got a knife and you've got a bow and arrow and you can cut whatever plants you want and you can make a fire and, you can cook whatever animal you want. And what are you going to choose to do? Where's your low-hanging fruit, like in a very literal way?
Right. So, I think also there's kind of going back to that, controversy between vegan and animal-based diets. That it's not, the recommendation that I'm hearing from you is certainly not to have mostly animal products.
Yes.
I think it was like 80% coming from plants. And then your recommendation of meat was like 2 servings a day, but playing deck.
Yeah, about
size.
Playing card size.
And then I think about when you go to a restaurant and you order a steak or a whatever, maybe that's like 6 or 7 playing decks on one plate of one meal.
Yeah.
Can you speak about, is it possible to eat too much animal product? What are the effects on the body when we're eating, much larger portions of animal products than you've recommended?
Sure. Well, again, I think there are some people who have poor protein digestion who might need a higher proportion of protein in their diet, especially menstruating women who tend to lose a lot of iron may need to have higher sources of red meats in particular in order to maintain adequate iron in their bloodstream. That being said, I think that if you go and you eat barbecue and you don't have any green beans with it, your body should be able to handle that. Don't do it every day. Probably, I think really the damage of eating too much animal protein is, there's really a kind of 2 things that it can do. One is that you're not leaving room for all the plant-based nutrients that you need, which are a lot. So, just by not getting those in, that's no good. 2, it can be a stress on our gallbladder. So basically what our gallbladder does is it holds bile, which helps emulsify fats when we ingest fats. For people who eat large servings of animal protein, a lot of times we'll need to put a whole bunch of bile into our digestive tract in order to emulsify the fats. For people who tend to not produce bile very well, so those who have liver stresses, or those who have a weak gallbladder that are prone to stones, they often don't do well with higher levels of animal fat just because it puts too much stress on that part of the system. Similarly, our kidneys also metabolize a lot of protein. So for those who have weak kidneys, a high protein diet is usually not advisable because that puts more stress on the kidneys. There's some people, like say those who have gouty arthritis, which is caused by the retention of uric acid in the joints. They try and eat what's called a low purine diet, which that's a type of protein that's found in some plants, but mostly in animal proteins. Personally, I've not seen low purine diets have a lot of effect on gout. And in my clinical experience, which granted is not a scientific study, but the patients that I've seen with gouty arthritis tend to do better and have less occurrence of gout if they control their sugar.
Interesting.
So I think, overall, it's a lot more dangerous to be eating too much sugar, starch, and grain and processed foods than it is to eat too much animal protein. Can you eat too much? Yeah, if you're excluding other stuff and if you're attacking your gallbladder and kidneys, yeah. But I think that's, at least in the United States right now, that's a much more difficult thing to do than overtaxing your adrenals and your pancreas by eating too much sugar.
Interesting. And, going back to that, kind of point that there's this huge sugar industry, perhaps that's why this information about the dangers of starch and sugars is, so greatly suppressed, kind of kept from us, because I keep hearing over and over from you that, it's the sugars, the starches, the blood sugar spikes, the inability of your body to regulate your blood sugar levels because you're eating so many of those high glycemic foods.
Absolutely.
That is really one of the biggest dangers. And so all this fixation on whether or not to eat animal products and whether or not to just be vegan is kind of leaving this big open kind of blind spot almost on the starches and sugars, and especially in the West where the carbohydrates are so greatly processed.
Yes.
So even you had mentioned a little while ago that people will often say, well, people have been eating grains for centuries. Just pointing out that the grains that we're consuming, unless we're going out of our way to have whole grain foods, the enriched flour, the grains and starches and sugars that are in most of the foods we're eating are unlike any of the grain, starches, and sugars that were eaten even 100 years ago, much less several hundred years ago.
Yes, we were speaking earlier, most corn right now is tetraploid, which means it has 4 copies of DNA rather than just 2, which is what a normal reproductive species would have. That's largely due to selective breeding, but it's also been due to genetic modification. And it's allowed corn to have a higher yield and have a higher usable content than non-adulterated corn, I'll say. But there's very little corn now that doesn't have a tetraploid genome. And many of our corn strains, too, have also been genetically modified with Bacillus tetracensus, I believe is the scientific name of a bacteria that helps the corn create its own pesticide. So for short, this is called BT corn, and it basically has this gene from a bacterium that's inserted into it, so it produces its own repellent for the corn weevil, which has been a wonderful thing for farmers because they no longer spray their products, but at the same time, we're ingesting a corn that has a genome that's unlike anything our body knows how to process. I guess going on to GMO foods, I think that the idea of genetically modifying something is not inherently wrong like a lot of people would believe. But I think that the consequences that it may have are something that we don't know because our body is only designed to process certain molecules. So not only certain molecules, but molecules that are shaped a certain way. And if we change the molecule structure or if we change its shape, then our body doesn't really know what to do with it. And so if it can't get rid of it or metabolize it, it'll just go put it in fat and store it somewhere until, it knows what to do with it. And I think that's a real danger because when we accumulate all these molecules that we can't excrete through our urine or through our feces or through breathing or through our skin, and we put them into fat, they end up having reactive ends that can react with different receptors on healthy tissues, bind them up or change the way those receptors function. And then that's where we're looking at potential problems in terms of DNA synthesis problems like cancer. And it's not to say, I don't think we've had GMO foods around long enough to go point the finger and say, this causes cancer. But the likelihood of it causing cancer is high just because we don't know how our bodies will be able to handle this, or if they'll be able to handle it. We don't have a mechanism in place to be able to handle these foods.
Right. And interestingly, the process of approving drugs for consumptions, medicine for consumption, involved this really lengthy process of, testing it for a period of time, looking at the long-term effects. Although, unfortunately, a lot of those drugs are not studied for long-term duration and long-term effects. But taking something like genetically modified foods have very little or maybe zero actual overlook in trying to determine how they affect the body.
Sure. And, and true to that, too, I mean, the body is so complex that, for us to, even to go point to one mechanism of action is very difficult. There's nothing that we can put in the body that doesn't have a multitude of effects.
Right.
So, just like if I were to go and eat something like sugar, it has an effect on my pancreas, it has an effect on my blood, it has an effect on my adrenal glands, it has an effect on my liver, and for me to just go and say, oh, well, sugar only affects my pancreas. That's a bit short-sighted. Same thing with GMO foods. We even if we were to try and find a pathway of metabolism for many of these foods, we likely could come up with one pathway, but that doesn't mean there aren't a dozen others.
And I've also heard that the genetically modified foods are not loved by our microbes in the gut, the good bacteria, so to speak. So, again, one of these areas that there's not necessarily a lot of ways to go and actually determine that. It's important to recognize that if people are observing effects based on dietary changes or maybe removing things from the diet, that serves as a big insight. A lot of times people are, I think, kind of fixated on wanting the scientific study that proves the thing or whatever. But there always has to be somebody to fund that study.
Yeah, well, what I tell people is that there's no double-blind randomized control trial that jumping out of an airplane with a parachute will save your life. And aren't you glad there's not? So there's no, the scientific community would not agree that there is a sufficient evidence base for wearing a parachute if you jump out of an airplane. There's, so I use that example.
Would you jump out of an airplane without one?
Yeah, would you? And so, I think that speaks a lot to, just because the mainstream scientific community hasn't gone and embraced something with open arms and says, well, we don't have enough data. That doesn't mean that we should, brush it off.
Right.
That doesn't mean that we should go and accept it as fact either. But, I think it's really up to the consumer of that data to decide what they want to do with it.
Can you speak more about what you were mentioning about the DNA of the corn being altered, and then maybe how that translates into recommendations for people? Like if we're just eating organic foods, will we be avoiding that? Polyploidy?
Yeah, the tetraploid corn. That's a good question, and I don't know enough about organically farmed corn to answer that entirely with authority. I believe that there are certain strains of corn that are not tetraploid, and those are more likely to be organic. That being said, I did read a study recently that said that they tested a human biome or something like that, or maybe it was a genome, I'm not sure, and it said that the average American is 60% corn, because we are eating corn not only directly through our diet, but we're also eating animals that also have corn-based diets.
Right.
And so a whole lot of our bodies right now is comprised of corn. So yeah, I think that, it's always better to eat organic. Again, that's not always possible, and your body should be able to have enough adaptive capacity to to deal with a stress, to deal with something that it doesn't quite know what to do with. Right. You just don't want to be putting it in that situation all the time.
Right. So what about the word heirloom? You hear about heirloom seeds. Would that be a way of knowing that you have seeds that...
Maybe, but there's no real teeth in that term. Just sort of like there's no real teeth in the term natural or anything like that. Like anybody can use that as a marketing term, and it doesn't necessarily have to hold weight. It doesn't mean that it's not true or doesn't have meaning, but that meaning could vary depending on the source.
Right.
So I think that if something calls itself heirloom, it certainly is more likely to be less modified or more nutrient dense. But it doesn't necessarily mean that. Really, the only terms that really have teeth right now in U.S. agriculture are organic, which means that it's not a genetically modified strain and that it was grown without pesticides for at least 3 years. Then the other one is non-GMO, which just means that it's not genetically modified, but it could use pesticides.
Right. And why exactly, can you explain a little bit more about why they would, and you said it's through selective breeding that they create this, so it's not actual genetic modification, like taking the bacterial DNA and putting it in the food. Why they were selective breeding to create this trait?
Basically, it creates better yields. So just sort of like we would selectively breed a wolf into a Chihuahua or into a Great Dane for a different purpose. Farmers have selectively bred corn in order to create a different flavor, create a different texture, create a larger kernel, create a higher yield of kernels per corn husk or per cob. They might even breed it for protein or fat content depending on how that corn will be used, either for feed or for human consumption.
Right. And then are there other plants that people should be aware of where this kind of situation also occurs?
I think, bananas are one. Every banana that you eat is a clone. All bananas don't have seeds. And the reason they don't have seeds is because they've been cloned from other banana plants by using cuttings and replanting cuttings. Again, this was due to selective breeding to breed out the seed of the banana in order to make it easier to consume.
Wow. I have never seen a banana with a seed, so
I know, me neither.
Didn't realize.
But if you look up pictures on Google of heritage bananas, or I don't know what you'd want to call them, they do have seeds.
Interesting.
And so, I don't think all bananas are bad, don't get me wrong, and, you can get the organic ones, and they're good. I mean, just because it's a clone doesn't mean it's bad, but, I think that's something to be aware of.
Yeah.
Apples tend to have some selective breeding. We've got a lot of different varieties of apples, and they've been heavily selectively bred. Which, granted, most of our produce has. I mean, even strawberries have been bred to have smaller and smaller seeds on the outside. Watermelons, same thing. We've bred them to have smaller and smaller seeds as well. That's not necessarily a terrible thing. Just like, is a Chihuahua a bad thing because it's not a wolf? A Chihuahua is a consequences of selective breeding. It's not a wolf, but that doesn't mean that it's bad. It's just a different thing.
Okay.
Because whenever they pre-cut them, they don't wash the knife. And so the incidence of listeria or bacterial contamination in pre-cut foods is very high. And I even saw, I had a bunch of patients this summer who were eating pre-cut watermelon, myself included, who were having digestive upset, and they had a big recall on pre-cut watermelon. And it seems like they do every so often. It's not just watermelon, it's any of the pre-cut fruits.
Okay.
And it's because they don't wash the cutting instruments. So if you do buy food that needs to be cut it yourself. Otherwise you're kind of risking exposure to some not so good bugs.
Interesting. And then what about the pre-washed greens? I always see the big boxes of pre-washed this and that. Is that?
I think they're fine if you're going to cook them. I think if you're going to use them for a salad, you probably ought to wash them again in vinegar. But if you're going to cook them, you're probably fine. And that's kind of the reason why I harp on pre-cut fruit, because you don't cook fruit.
Right.
And if you cook stuff like listeria can't survive if you cook it. So as long as you cook your greens, pre-washed is fine, but if you're going to use it as a salad, make sure you wash it again. And vinegar is usually the best thing
Just
to
like
use.
white vinegar, or
you can just
apple
use
cider
white vinegar
vinegar?
and whatever you like. It
Okay.
doesn't matter. It basically just lowers the pH enough to where it can't survive.
Okay.
So,
And then so things like pre-cut vegetables that you're going to cook.
yeah, if you're going to cook them,
be okay.
fine. If you're going to do them raw, make sure you do a vinegar wash.
Okay. That's, wow, really fantastic information. So to kind of bring it back full circle where we began, you know, talking about how the Eastern and Western medicine has a lot of overlap. Can you maybe talk about some examples, you know, based on the different topics that we've discussed today?
Sure. So, like, if we come back, you know, my big thing with diet is sugar, because I think that's the most pervasive problem in the general population right now. And so, yeah, if we look at high glycemic foods, which are things like sugar, starch, grain, alcohol, certain dairy products, processed foods, the Chinese would go and say that all of those foods do something which is called creating dampness, which, according to Chinese theory, it gunks up your channels and makes it to where things don't move well, and eventually increases like fat deposition on the body and increases inflammation, things like that. And so I find it very interesting, you know, that even the Chinese kind of advocate a low glycemic diet. Similarly, the Chinese also advocate a largely plant-based but occasional animal-sourced diet as well, just like with the bone broth example. Chinese mostly use their foods as herbs, and most of the medicinal foods tend to be plant-based. However, there's certain foods that are very, very medicinal for certain purposes that are animal-based. So, for example, shellfish tend to do very well for reproductive problems. So I think that's largely due to their mineral content. It's very good for hormone synthesis and adrenal rebuilding in shellfish. Similarly, the Chinese would say, don't eat shrimp if you have a cold. Not exactly sure why that is true, but I did experiment with myself, and one time I had a cold and I ate shrimp, and it did make it worse. And it's interesting too, like Chinese will say each food will have certain temperature and a certain meridians that it goes into, and we treat foods very much like herbs. There's really no separation among them. And so, like, they talk about heat-based illness, which usually when you have a heat-based illness, you have a fever of some kind. And so they'll advocate cooling foods like leafy greens, which are high in vitamin C. It can help break a fever. And they'll also advocate cooling meats like chicken or duck. And if we look at those, which is really interesting, those particular meats, and bone broth as well, contains a really high amount of immunoglobulins in it, much more so than other types of meats. And so, you know, it kind of all comes full circle, using foods as medicines, both from a Chinese viewpoint as well as a Western molecular viewpoint.
Wow. And so you think about chicken soup when you're sick.
Yeah, it actually works. And there's a reason that it's chicken and not pork or beef or whatever, which is really shocking.
Right. Very interesting. Are there any other, I guess, kind of fun food facts that you'd like to share here?
Liver's the only source of vitamin B4. If you're not eating liver, you are by definition vitamin B deficient, which is why I advocate either eating dietary liver or doing a desiccated liver supplement. It's absolutely essential. And myself, as well as many patients that I've put on liver products, either dietary or desiccated, tend to notice a pretty significant change, both in digestion and then just overall energy. I find it very interesting, like Arnold Schwarzenegger used to talk in the 70s about using liver to help with his athletic performance and energy levels, and it really does change the amount of energy level, which I believe is due to a very high portion of B4, which we just don't get from other sources. So yeah, I think liver, even back in the old days where they'd give kids, have them stand in line, you have your cod liver oil, that's not only essential for amino acids, but also for vitamin B complex. And I think that's, our move away from eating liver in our more modern culture in the last 40, 50 years, certainly I think has contributed to some of these long-standing illnesses like autoimmune issues, cancers, things like that. So I think that it's very important for people to have some source of liver in their diet.
Interesting. And I think it was off camera that you mentioned this, but you had, mentioned that the liver is often associated with anger. I've heard people say gallbladder and liver related to, feelings of resentment and things like that. So kind of thinking about the reduction of liver in our diets. Most people, aren't eating liver on a very regular basis. But then we see these things like irritability, low tolerance for stress, and, things like road rage and all of these examples of like, we're just kind of high strung. We maybe have this built up anger and stuff. So I almost even wonder if, that supplementing those liver foods might even help us calm down a bit too.
I think it absolutely can. I mean, I almost feel like when I do a desiccated liver, it's almost like a happy pill. And I think that's just because of the B content. Same thing, like I've done certain B vitamins that have like just a live B complex in them, and it tastes terrible, but it really it's like instant difference in mood. And so, yeah, the Chinese would say that the liver totally controls our irritability, anger, resentment, same with gallbladder. And it's very likely, the Chinese would agree that our lack of liver in our diet is a huge player.
Well, I tell you what, I'm craving liver right now.
I can't say that I am, but I'm going to go eat it anyway.
I don't think I've ever actually eaten liver in my life, but I'm tempted to try it now, or at least maybe try the supplement that you mentioned.
Yeah, well, I find that most people, if you're going to do dietary liver, the most palatable way for the majority of people is either do a pate or do like something, a liverwurst. It tends to be a bit more flavorful and a little bit less...
livery.
A little bit less livery, a little bit less bitter. So anyway, yeah, for many of my people who want to do liver, they like to get it in and be fancy that way. Some people like to just go and do liver and onions just like their grandma used to do. So I'm not one of those, but some people are.
Well, Jessica, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to come in today and share all of this with us. I've learned so much from you.
Oh, well, it's such a pleasure. Thank you for having me. It was really a treat to be here.
Yeah, and I know when we had we're kind of planning out our talk for today, we even had several other things on the list we were going to discuss, and it ended up all being dietary. So I definitely want to have you back on the program.
Oh, I would love to be here. Absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
I also want to thank all of you for tuning into the podcast today. I hope that you found it informative. If you'd like to learn more about Jessica and maybe find some of those patient resources, you can find her at holisticpainsolutions.com. If you'd like to see the full video interview of this program, along with hundreds of other health and wellness videos, you can check out wellnessplus.tv and start your free 2-week trial today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and come back and join us again soon.
We at Wellness Plus specialize in all things health and wellness, ranging from yoga and fitness to massage and ASMR. Whether you are looking to target specific areas of tension or want to enhance your general self-care routine, we provide the tools you need to feel better, look better, and live better. We have courses for every level, whether you're just starting out or you're a seasoned pro. Our courses provide a wide range in difficulty to accommodate your evolving flow.
Welcome back to Yoga with Jess. We are going to break down some really essential postures.
We are going to rock out with some of the most essential ab exercises that you need to have the abs that you've always dreamed of.
I've blended techniques to help you connect with students, and you can be a rock star teacher.
Wellness Plus is available on your phone, tablet, or TV. Join Wellness Plus today and get your first 7 days free.